Hi, I'm Amanda Banks, a research associate with the Mesmer Research Group. Our group is based out of the Industrial Systems Engineering and Engineering Management Department at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. We invite guest speakers from a variety of disciplines to present on topics of interest in the systems engineering field. This is a recording of a guest lecture from Dr. David Illingworth. Dr. Illingworth is a President's Postdoctoral Fellow in the Department of Psychology at the University of Maryland. He earned his PhD in engineering psychology from the Georgia Institute of Technology and now works in the University of Maryland's program of neuroscience and cognitive science. He recently spoke to our group about applications of a memory model of decision-making. We are honored to host Dr. Illingworth, and we hope that you enjoy his presentation.
So there it is, applications of a memory model of decision-making. But the more I thought about it as I put this talk together, I felt like, if I can control this, a better title might be Toward a Unified Theory of Resource Acquisition. And that'll kind of make sense as I try to eloquently move between really fine detail about the kinds of work I do and broad perspective of the implications of this work. So really at the core of what I'm working on these days is trying to understand and formally model a cognitive mechanism for valuation. Specifically, in my work, I tend to focus on information foragers, physicians, intelligence analysts, and really anyone involved in human inquiry. This ranges from scientists who formalize hypotheses, test them, go about gathering data via experimentation or other methods, to people who are merely on a fact-finding mission on the internet, Googling things they're unaware of, trying to learn more about the situation, their environment, whatever the case may be. So as it relates to all these various kinds of individuals, I have very specific research questions that sort of define my interests. First, how do decision makers populate consciousness with options? In laboratory settings, we often provide for participants or professionals, whoever we happen to be studying, the options that they are to consider. And this can include hypotheses about the world. So for the physician, the specific diseases that they ought to be considering when they're engaged in a diagnostic task and trying to figure out what is ailing a patient. To information foragers, we say, here are the possible sources of information that you have to choose from. Go ahead and engage in your information foraging. And in the real world, that's not really how things manifest. It's incumbent on the decision maker themselves to populate their minds with the options that they're going to later consider. Second, how do decision makers perceive value in those options? There are plenty of utility theories, valuation theories, but oftentimes they're a little bit lacking in terms of their application to cognition and how we capture how the memory system specifically might contribute to those perceptions of value. Third, how do decision makers perceive acquisition costs? At least in psychology, this end of the equation is often ignored. We focus primarily on how do people perceive use, how do they perceive value, how does that contribute to decisions of choice, diagnostic decisions, information selection, and so on. Very little has gone in the ways of trying to explain how people perceive costs, the things that are going to inhibit or stand in their way of acquiring their resources. And then finally, how do decision makers decide to terminate acquisition? Any rational system has to balance the potential benefits of engaging in resource acquisition or information foraging, as it may be, balance that with the cost of carrying on in that behavior. And at some point, there's either going to be a task switch where you go from information gathering to then acting on that acquired knowledge, or whole-scale terminating the act of accumulating this resource, accumulating information. And this wasn't a particularly deep insight, but I did realize that there's a lot in common with information foragers and all types of resource foragers. These could be business types, literal businesses that are going about acquiring resources either for the building of materials or smaller companies that become part of a larger corporation. When we were offline a moment ago, we were talking about baseball, but these are the kinds of decisions that people who build baseball teams make. They perceive value in various players. They put their team together at some point. They're constrained by the amount of money the team has. And generally speaking, when we go about acquiring the resources we need in our daily life, we are doing much of these same behaviors. We have some perceived value in the resources we're going to acquire. There's some point at which we decide some things are worth it, some things are not, and we terminate that resource acquisition or switch to using those resources before later switching back to having to acquire them again. So the big picture here is that all of these individuals are engaged in acquisition decisions. Generally speaking, evaluating the benefits of acquiring something, information, some other resources, against the cost of acquiring that same thing, be it information or some other resource. So there are some limitations with what's currently available for us to make sense of all of these behaviors. First of all, there are a lot of normative or formal rules in the literature. Some of these come out of economics, some of these come out of psychology, but generally speaking, people are unreliable and inconsistent. And so it's hard to devise a normative formal rule that actually captures the complicated behaviors people often engage in. There's any number of resource utility models to explain, in my field, information foraging, but I'm sure they're prevalent in other spaces as well. Some of these metrics are psychologically untenable. They sort of assume the decision maker is omniscient. They have access to information they've not yet acquired in order to perceive what is objectively the most useful, the highest utility piece of information or resource that they could acquire. And there's just a matter of shortening the distance between their current state and that optimal state. And then, of course, there are some memory-based heuristics which begin to bridge this gap I was alluding to earlier in terms of explaining how the cognitive system actually gives rise to these behaviors, this perception of value, but they tend to orient only on value, on the benefit to be gleaned from the acquisition of these resources, thus ignoring the costs. And then finally, generally speaking, these theories lack explicit stopping rules and can't account for the termination decisions. With the exception of one, which is why I cite them here, the stopping rules selection theory. However, this is a toolbox approach which has its own problems. It's cognitively demanding to engage the memory system to first determine the situation you're in, recognize which class of stopping rule is going to be most appropriate for the task you're engaged in, then go back to the memory system to extract that stopping rule from memory and then use it in whichever task you're engaged in. That's many steps to explain something that is much more fluid and automatic. So there's a need here to improve the theory to have this holistic understanding of how the cognitive system gives rise to this kind of behavior. So I'm borrowing from the hygiene cognitive architecture. This is hypothesis generation. And the idea here is that when we populate consciousness, populate working memory with ideas, this comes about from the memory system. And it's a special case of cued recall. And I'll go into that in some detail here. Generally speaking, this is how the model works. There's some environment that exists outside the cognitive system, internal to the human being, denoted by this red dotted line. From the environment, there are observable pieces of information. So in the case of the physician, these could be the early signs and symptoms their patients present. We assume that that information gets compared against past episodes in episodic memory, and that those traces in episodic memory from past experience become differentially activated with respect to a similarity gradient to the current situation. So the similarity between a trace in episodic memory to the current case is going to dictate the degree to which these prior experiences become activated in memory. These activated traces are then combined to create a schematic representation of the world, an unlabeled one. It's an idea that has formed that accounts for everything you're seeing in your environment. That unidentified probe then gets compared against everything you know about, everything in your crystallized semantic memory. And the degree to which the things you know about become activated, if they exceed a certain threshold in the model as specified by ACMIN, the minimum activation, it gets populated into the working memory construct we call the SOC, the set of leading contenders. And the system then iterates through this process to see if there are more relevant ideas, more relevant hypotheses, in the case of the physician disease hypotheses, that might explain those early observations. If there's no hypothesis that exceeds this minimum threshold, we check against the K-max rule. The K-max rule just keeps track of how many memory failures there are, the number of times you go to the well of memory and you come back with nothing that's usable. And once you reach K-max, you've exhausted the degree to which you can engage in hypothesis generation. You have to stop trying to populate your mind with possible explanations for what you're seeing in the world. You can then use that set of leading contenders, those hypotheses that are most strongly represented by the schema that was driven by your past experiences, to re-engage the environment. You can engage in hypothesis testing, seek out the information that's going to evaluate the current set of explanations that you're entertaining, or you can engage in probability judgment, or even determine the value of engaging in any number of courses of action in the physician's world. We're talking about treatments. So from this, we have a model, a theory of how the decision maker populates their mind with options. In this case, it's hypotheses to be considered, the beliefs that are going to drive a person to seek out information to specifically evaluate hypotheses, to test their validity or invalidity, the degree to which they actually explain all the things you're encountering in the environment. So we're going to extend this model now to account for that behavior, hypothesis testing, the selection or design of a test whose outcome is expected to reveal something about the true status of a hypothesis. So this information that we're going to glean, we have indirect access to it, and we're going to see what available to us do we expect to differentiate the hypotheses currently under consideration. In general, this is an ubiquitous process. It can manifest as saccadic behavior. You hear a loud noise behind us, you immediately have expectations, and then you'll change your gaze, move your eyes to the source of the loud noise to evaluate those early hypotheses. If you're engaged in problem solving, as I imagine many of you might be, the implementation of a new solution to a problem is sort of a hypothesis test. The hypothesis being that your new solution to the problem is going to work, is actually going to have some realized change on the problem you're trying to resolve. So many of us are engaged in what we would consider a hypothesis test in our everyday behavior. And this is important to study for very obvious reasons. It dictates what information you have on hand for downstream behaviors. In the physician's case, which medical tests they run is going to dictate the information they have to generate a diagnosis and determine which treatments are most appropriate for their patients. But there are many applied domains with high impact decisions where this is the case. So we need a way to turn the activations of the memory system into perceived value. And the way I've done this is by using a bounded rational form of Bayesian diagnosticity. So I'm using more or less the exact same equation, but I'm replacing the dependencies on hypotheses for the value of data with activations in memory as a consequence of considering the various hypotheses in the SOC. An easy way to think about this is that relative memory activation is the relative perceived value for a source of information in this context. Um, Bear in mind that this is an open and active area of research. This is one rather simple solution for turning signals in memory to represent how people are going to value a resource, in this case, value information. So there's myriad rules that we can do the same thing with, turn into a bounded rational form. This is what I have as of this moment. And so this is what I'm using to model perceived value in sources of information. So what's critically important in my domain, and we're getting more into the nuances of uh, studying information foraging in the cognitive decision context. Uh, my information ecology has to be very controlled. I have to know and control the statistical relationship between any piece of information my decision makers might observe and how it relates to the true state of the world. So for the sake of making this simple, I'm going to cover most of that. These values, though, represent the probability of any given hypothesis, disease hypotheses in this paradigm. Given that you've seen one of 4 first presenting cues, you'll see that these are controlled such that each cue is equally informative, at least as measured by Bayesian diagnosticity. And they're designed in such a way to control which disease hypotheses you should most strongly entertain when engaging in additional information acquisition behavior and ultimately diagnosis. So just as an example, if you see presenting symptom number 1, the strongest hypothesis is hypothesis number 1, the second strongest is hypothesis 2, and then you should have relatively weak belief in hypotheses 3 and 4, and you'll notice that it's a staggered design where it's the exact same pattern of beliefs. All that changes is the specific hypotheses that you are most strongly considering, provided whatever information you're initially encountered with. Subsequently, I've manipulated the diagnostic value of each of the medical tests. I've done so assuming that, or controlling that, each source of information is equally informative, equally diagnostic, provided you have equal priors across the different disease states. So if you've not yet seen presenting symptoms, each of the 4 tests should be equally informative, equally diagnostic. Once you've seen a presenting cue and that's changed the distribution of belief across the various disease hypotheses, it is your change in belief that's going to, or at the very least, it's the model's change in belief that's going to drive the perceptions of value in different sources of information. And so here's some very simple model behavior collapse across many different parameters that are not important to get into for the purposes of this talk. But you'll note that the model now gives us a pretty straightforward and testable hypothesis that when an information forager in this paradigm has seen Q1, they should have a very strong preference for test 1 as a consequence of the relative memory strength and support of selecting that source of information from the model. That same pattern of behavior is true for Q2, preference for test 2, Q3, preference for test 3, Q4, preference for test 4. This might seem relatively straightforward, and that's mostly because it is. We have yet in the field of psychology to really evaluate and test the connection between the formation and dynamic changes in a decision maker's belief and the pattern of information foraging that they subsequently engage in. And you can't think about that as the pattern of resource acquisition that they engage in as a consequence of the expectations, the beliefs that they're generating as a consequence of that prior experience. So most studies in my field focus on the information. There's an prevailing assumption that there's something magical, something important about the information source itself, and neglect the human, neglect the decision maker, and what it is that gives rise to their perceptions of value. And what's somewhat ironic about that is that just about every model or utility metric I can find to conceptualize information value has a parameter for belief in a hypothesis. And so here I'm explicitly trying to evaluate that, to control that, and capture how changes in those beliefs and the expectation of the human agent give rise to those differential preferences in information selection. So here's the experimental paradigm. We first have our participants learn that statistical relationship between the various cues, test results, and disease states that were on that prior slide. So, we'll show them the presenting cue initially, then the results of all 4 medical tests appear, and rather than passively be told what the correct disease state is, they begin the learning trials not knowing anything and being forced to guess. And over time, with added experience, you see that the accuracy in their diagnoses grow over time, and I'll show you those results in a second. The test trial is very similar. We present them with a presenting cue. It's now up to them to dictate which tests, if any, get selected and the subsequent result is shown. So they actually have to go about clicking on the tests they want. They can select as few as 0 and as many as all that are available. For this experiment, there were 4. When they make their diagnoses in the test trials, they do not receive feedback on the accuracy of their diagnosis. So very quickly, here's their learning results. We do see that gradually over time, their accuracy improves, indicating that they are internalizing that statistical structure. You should also be aware that there's a bound here to how accurate they can be. Even someone who has perfect knowledge of the world is not going to be performing at 100% on this task, just given the probabilistic nature of the presentation of signs, symptoms, and the results of tests and the diseases that are driving the manifestation of all this data. So I shouldn't have to go into too much detail here. Generally speaking, the results speak for themselves. You could practically map the behavioral data to the predictions of the model up above. It is the case that the presenting cue dictates preference. Well, first, selection patterns, yes or no, were the tests selected. We also did some preference analyses on this data, and people do exhibit a preference, meaning that they're selecting the predicted tests earlier in the sequence of tests selected as a consequence of the presenting cue. So we find this interaction between the presenting cue and the test selection. And again, it's a very preliminary finding. It's the foundation upon which more complex experimentation can be built. But it's at the very least establishes the foundation that when you keep the utility of the information source constant, independent of belief, and then manipulate belief on the back end, you do manifest these differential patterns of preference across the available pieces of information. So I spoke a little bit earlier about needing to think about acquisition costs, what it takes for an information forager to actually gain access to the information that they need in order to improve their understanding of the world they're in and make better judgments, more accurate decisions. So I'm going to show you some preliminary results of a few other experiments I have going on. This might be complicated, so I'm going to focus primarily on this centered group of bars. So in this experiment, the task was nearly identical to that which I just presented to you. All that I changed was the access cost. So in the test phase, rather than merely click on the various buttons to have test results appear, I also deducted from their bank. I think I glossed over this or forgot to mention it entirely, but we rewarded accurate diagnoses with like 1,000 points, $1,000 that get added to a bank that they accumulate over the course of the entire experiment. So in the test phase of this experiment, they have to sacrifice some of those funds, some of the monies, the game dollars that they've accumulated over the course of the learning phase in order to see results. What's cool about that, and it's a question I've gotten at various conferences, how can you tell that your participants are taking this in any way seriously and actually valuing the points? I mean, first of all, we see that in any number of video games that people play on their phones. They're willing to spend lots of real money in order to gain access to levels of the game that will get them more points. And that's essentially the behavior we see here. As acquisition costs increase to see the same test results I was presenting just a moment earlier, the number of tests selected decrease. So they're sensitive to these cost functions. I also manipulated the order in which they experience these cost conditions. So these red bars are individuals who experience zero cost first. The yellow bar is seeing $100 cost for each test in the first trial or first block of trials. And then the orange bar is seeing $200 costs for those same tests in the first block of test trials. And you'll note that there's a significant difference in terms of how these individuals are perceiving costs. So if you've seen, if you were freely acquiring information initially, 100 seems like an awful steep price to pay for that same information. Alternatively, if you saw a more expensive condition first, the $200 condition, $100 suddenly seems like not so high a tax on your information foraging. And so you see this gradient of how encountering these different cost distributions across available information changes the behavior. So the memory system, in a way, is also accumulating experience with the costs involved in acquiring information. And that is feeding into whatever decision individuals are making when balancing value, potential benefit from to be gleaned information and the cost of acquiring it. In this other experiment, after each test selection, I had individuals tell me how confident they were that they knew which disease was ailing the patient. So you'll note that for individuals who only selected one piece of information, one test, and in this experiment, I did require that they select at least one. Their judgment of knowing, the degree to which they metacognitively said, I know what's going on here, was quite high. And that appears to be near some threshold, as individuals who selected two pieces of information were initially not very certain, but grew to be very certain at the point at which they terminated search. Same was true for individuals who selected three pieces of information. And the same trend is there for people who selected four, but you might also imagine that people who don't really know what's going on in the world are the ones who need to do the most information acquisition. And so they're selecting all four, and their final confidence, their final judgment of knowing isn't quite as high as those who are selecting one, two, or three pieces of information. And you'll see that that's the general trend we're seeing. Like, what is their belief? What is their confidence at the point in termination? So all of these elements are combining to dictate not only which sources of information people are drawn to, but it also dictates their perceptions of costs and what they are or are not willing to acquire. And it's also contributing to when they're going to stop acquisition.
So it looks like Dr. Mesmer's got his hand raised.
Okay.
Yeah, David, a quick clarification on these experiments. What kind of information, so are they medical doctors that you're asking or medical students? And what kind of information are you giving them about the tests and the conditions prior?
So these are all undergraduates, and all of their knowledge about the information comes from their own experience. So I go about building it up during that learning phase, and that's where they learn about the value of the source of information in terms of its ability to differentiate varying states of the world. And they dictate what it is that they're going to make use of in the second phase of the experiment. All I do is present a cost and tell them you are engaging in the same behavior, but instead of all the information being immediately available to you, you dictate what gets presented, and you can select as much of it as you want. So it's entirely up to the participant to determine how much information they acquire and specifically which sources of information get exploited.
I see. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So all of this work is sort of involved in some theory development. These four squares that I have already on the screen sort of represent hygiene, that hypothesis generation model that I sort of described earlier. And what's going on here is we're now going to take those beliefs, those expectations, those explanations for the world that people are generating on their own, and use those, leverage them to try and make sense of why they're selecting the information that they do. Why is it that they perceive cost the way they do? Why do they perceive value the way they do? And we're asking different kinds of decision questions. So they're perceiving some utility, some cost in these sources of information. And it's only when they perceive that that utility is exceeding some idiosyncratic threshold that they're actually going to exploit these sources of information and re-engage the environment. And you see that the way we're rebuilding this model, that environment feeds into memory, and that memory now feeds into the valuation judgments themselves, because we've detected that experience is not only giving rise to perceptions of value, but also perceptions of cost. And then ultimately, when people perceive that the value of further engagement in information foraging does not exceed some threshold, they'll terminate or they'll switch tasks and move on to something else. So evaluation testing of this model is going to dictate my empirical work from this point going forward. So I'm going to kind of engage into a quick transition here. That's sort of the theory development end of the equation. And I'm going to talk more about those applications. So provided that we do, develop these models of human decision-making, human information foraging, human resource acquisition, other than explaining the phenomena themselves, what can these things be used for? So I'm going to give you an example of how they might be leveraged for decision support systems when professionals are under are under the pressure of having a lot of information to have to manage. So this was all part of an IARPA-funded research program called Forecasting Counterfactuals in Uncontrolled Settings. I was on a multi-institute team. These were my specific collaborators for this project. Rick Thomas at Georgia Tech, Michael Doherty here at the University of Maryland, Betty Whitaker at GTRI, and Ethan Truitt also at GTRI. So for this program, we were tasked with trying to design some interventions that were going to improve intelligence agents' ability to project into the future and anticipate the timing and magnitude of future events. This turns out to be a very challenging task, and I think the long story short is we kind of failed in that regard. But we did develop some tools that we think are going to be useful moving forward, first for understanding what these individuals are doing, and secondly, if we can get them there, developing them to the point where they can actually reason about real world information and provide recommendations to intelligence analysts. So what we did was extract information from the GDALT database, which contains information about news articles published worldwide. So we extract this information and tag it as memory. So each article published served as one episode in memory. And so we can further mark it up by which people were involved, where did it take place, what organizations were involved. And we can use those tags as semantic knowledge. So the model, just pulling information from this database, now has an episodic memory filled with many instances in recent or long-term history, and crystallized knowledge about the things, people, and places where these events take place. And what the model is going to be able to do is generate hypotheses about who the relevant individuals are, where the likely places events are going to be, and which organizations may or may not be involved in future events. It's also going to be able to output a probability judgment and engage in essentially hypothesis testing, suggesting to the operator what information is necessary in order to further disambiguate this space. And it can make predictions about a number of experimental effects. The one I'm going to end up talking about in a few moments is the wisdom of the crowd within, how you can repeatedly extract information from one individual in hopes of improving their judgments over the course of time. So here's a quick demonstration of how the model works. This model implementation is still in its infancy, so Some of this might come across as straightforward, but if you broaden it out, the implications are quite important. So the counterfactual, I should explain counterfactual reasoning real quick. A counterfactual is an alternative history and an alternative sequence of events. So if we were to think about the 1960s, we might imagine, how would American culture and politics have evolved had John F. Kennedy not been assassinated? So it would be an alternative state, an alternative history that we could reason about. And the idea is that as you reason about alternative histories, you become better calibrated to the features of the environment that actually give rise to the events that take place. What's difficult about that is that they're hard to judge for accuracy because they are alternative histories. So provided that you're making projections given an alternative history, how do you evaluate the accuracy of those judgments? We don't know, and apparently neither did our program managers, but regardless, what the model is doing here is assuming that there is an act of terror originating from the nation of Iran. What people, organizations would be relevant and accountable. We're also going to probe the model with counterfactuals. So it is as though we are asking the model who would be accountable, who would be responsible, who would be involved if these attacks were happening in Syria, and similarly, who would be involved if the attacks were taking place in Mexico. So we extracted the GDALT database for the week before Qasem Soleimani was killed. We simulated 30 individuals for each parameter combination, and I'll explain that in a moment. We changed encoding quality across 3 levels, high, medium, and low. We also changed the criterion for how strongly activated a memory has to be to contribute to reasoning. As you can imagine that this database is extensive, and the quality of one's reasoning may only be of sufficient quality to project accurately the future if you only capitalize on the activation of more activated memories, meaning they're most relevant to the current situation. And then, of course, we're manipulating the probe, Iran, Syria, or Mexico, essentially asking the question, what are you thinking about it? What are you thinking about provided the attack is originating from Iran, Syria, or the nation of Mexico? And outputting from this model is going to be the people and organizations that it thinks might be responsible for this attack. So first, this is just a simple validation. When you probe with Iran, you get Iran back. Iran is represented by these yellow bars. So the model is acting appropriately. When you probe with Mexico, you get back Mexico. When you probe with Syria, you get back Syria. And when you probe with these 3 nations, an unrelated nation like Australia does not ever really have a lot of support behind it. It doesn't quite get generated or considered by the model. I'm primarily going to use this slide to sort of explain the manipulations. So you'll see that there are different levels of encoding, that is the L or learning parameter, and you get the strongest activations from the model when the quality of encoding is highest. You'll also see where we've manipulated the threshold for which memories contribute to reasoning. And as the quality of those activations or the level of those activations becomes higher, you get the highest levels of activations from the model in support of the various hypotheses, or in this case, the nations involved in the terrorist attack. So we then ask the model to think about people, generate the individuals that are likely to be responsible for the attack. When we probe the model with Iran, it comes back with Qasem Soleimani. When we probe the model with Syria, it comes back with al-Baghdadi. And you'll note that when we probe with Mexico, none of these individuals, John Kasich sort of being that unimportant check on the model, none of these individuals get a lot of support from the memory system of the model. And then asking the model to reason about which organizations are likely to be involved in the planning of these attacks. It gets a little bit messier, but if we look at the highest levels of encoding and where we place thresholds for only the most activated traces in memory, we do get from Iran Quds Force, and from Syria, we get ISIL. You might also notice, interestingly, that when we probe with Iran, we get Los Zetas, a cartel in Mexico. And the cartel isn't very highly activated when Mexico is the probe. And at lower levels of the A sub C criterion, we actually get ISIL being generated by the model. We were initially a little worried about this, thinking that the model was reasoning poorly, but it actually turned out that there was a fair amount of information, at the very least in the media sphere, about connections between Iran and Mexican drug cartels. And so the model in this instance was actually reasoning more accurately than we could because it knew about things that we had no idea about. So this is sort of an interesting, though not highly applicable just yet, example of what these models are capable of doing. They have perfect knowledge of these environments and are able to generate that which the human operator may not conceive of given the lack of information they either have exposure to or are able to generate from memory to use for the purposes of reasoning. So one of the notions of our program was that since intelligence analysts often work on their own, we could capitalize on a phenomenon known as the wisdom of the crowd within to make them better calibrated, more accurate in their judgments over the course of their analysis. So some of you may be familiar with the wisdom of the crowd phenomenon more broadly. It's merely the premise that individuals possess unique and independent knowledge about some event. And so if you sample from any number of individuals, they will have a distribution of knowledge, and extracting that knowledge and having them make a judgment about some event or recollecting some fact about history. When you aggregate across all of these independent sources of knowledge, you're going to wind up with an answer that is relatively close to the true state of the world. So here we are sampling from multiple analysts. You can have many individuals on a team contribute some judgment of some event, and hopefully the aggregation of those estimates will be closer to truth. To do so, however, each time you elicit a judgment from an individual analyst, you are also sampling from their internal distribution of knowledge. That is to say that they don't necessarily have access to all information stored in memory at any given moment in time. And so the act of making one judgment is a manifestation of whatever information came to mind in that instance. So as if in some studies, they found that if you wait long enough, essentially 2 weeks, analysts become, or judges in general, become less capable of anchoring on those previous judgments, resample from their own knowledge in order to make that same judgment again. And it is often the case that if you ask them to make the same judgment at least 3 times, maybe as many as 5 times, the aggregation of those 3 to 5 judgments is going to wind up being more accurate than would be any singular estimation. So the idea here was to elicit multiple judgments from multiple judges and have sort of a super aggregation of estimates in hopes of facilitating more accurate judgments from a team of intelligence analysts. So the trick is to figure out ways of introducing interference in a shorter period of time, because intelligence agents don't often have 2 weeks to sit around waiting to forget their initial set of judgments to make a new set. So I'm going to skip over this because I realize we're running out of time. But the manipulations for this study were twofold. First, we engaged in information paucity, which meant that we broke up the entire set of data they were going to have made available to them to make their judgments over 4 different information periods. So they would get 1 block of data, make a judgment, get an independent block of data, make another judgment, independent data, independent data. The second manipulation was perspective taking. And in that condition, in analysts, these were actual analysts, would be given a scenario to reason about. They would make their predictive forecasts, and then they would be given the exact same information, but asked to consider it from an alternative perspective, someone with a different set of priorities, or even someone who held a slightly different role. So instead of an analyst, maybe someone who worked in the government bureaucracy for which this judgment was most important. And the idea was that that would force them to engage in a semantic shift, change the information that they were extracting from their own minds in order to get a slightly different judgment, essentially sample from different places in their own distribution of knowledge. So generally speaking, this is what we've found, that when you engage in either information paucity or perspective taking, or both, you do increase the number of hypotheses that an analyst is going to consider. In this context, a hypothesis was a causal scenario, so a way of explaining how this complex environment gave rise to a specific outcome, such as the assassination of JFK. And you'll note that we had people with different backgrounds reasoning about different domains. There was a financial domain and a health domain, and we had experts from each. Neither of those things seemed to matter, but that's just in terms of the quantity of hypotheses that were generated. We looked at the quality of the hypotheses, which we defined as diversity of thought. We engaged in some latent semantic analysis just to see how dissimilar their generated hypotheses were from each other. And we defined more diverse thought as generating a more unique set of hypotheses. And you'll note that the hypotheses were most dissimilar when engaged in both paucity and perspective taking. And once again, the domain or their area of expertise did not matter at all. So the general takeaway, I'm going to skip across this, is that there's a connection between the hypotheses we generate, the explanations that we consider to explain a set of observations and information that is bidirectional. The information we encounter is going to change the way we generate hypotheses, change the way we reason about an environment, and the hypotheses we generate is going to dictate which sources of information we deem are most influential. And generally speaking, these are my future directions: to continue developing this memory model, hygiene, to account for more complex information acquisition behavior, to consider both top-down and bottom-up influences that place constraints on the environment, be it the institutions people work for or the individual cognitive limitations of the decision maker. And I'll leave it there and take any questions you might have.
So let's take a look at the question that Dr. Mesmer dropped in the chat. He says that there looks like there's significant relationships between the determination of which tests to perform and what tests verify the system performance to conduct. What are your thoughts on the challenges to applying this in, say, product development?
Right, that was actually something we encountered in the review process of the manuscript, right? The criticism was that while these objective metrics that you're criticizing make similar predictions, in the context of the experiment we're conducting, however, we're keeping those things static. And it's a mere demonstration of the importance of the memory system underlying the perceptions of value, and how changing which beliefs are entertained by an agent at any given time change those perceptions of value independent of whichever metric you're using, right? So in terms of leveraging this for product development, I suppose it depends on which element of that you're interested in. Because if you're looking at the agent and what they value, they're going to be considering the cues that define for them the problem they're trying to solve. And that's going to give rise to belief that any number of solutions are going to be the best path forward. And the space in which they begin to push their design is going to be a consequence of these early ideas. I mean, that may seem a little abstract because that may reflect the degree to which I understand what you all are working on here. But does that answer your question? Or
Yeah, the question got spurred on by the top left figure here. When you're looking at so in engineering, right, we need to verify we meet the requirements and we need to test the system performance. And there's different ways to do that, and some are more expensive than others, right? So I was
Right.
wondering if you had gone into like the product development world yet with this understanding.
I've not, but
Okay.
because it's on my mind, I can try and answer this by thinking about some of the things I was just discussing with a biologist colleague out here, right? It's a little similar in terms of where in a space you're going to uh, engage in exploitative behaviors, right? So instead of it being, you know, a maze or an external environment where you're tracking the movement of animals and where they forage for resources, we're talking about engineers, designers who are selecting a space that they're going to capitalize on for the sake of solving their problems. And I guess what I'm saying and what the model is showing is that the reasons why designers or engineers, in whatever the case may be, perceive value in that space is a consequence of what they know, what they've experienced, and the degree to which the problem they're trying to solve in the moment resembles problems they've tried to solve in the past. Because it's the experience that they can leverage, it's what they know about. And so they're going to tend to move into spaces that their idiosyncratic knowledge helps them perceive value in. Because it may be the case that there's an objectively more valuable space somewhere else. But as a consequence of a lack of generating the idea because you don't have the requisite knowledge to recognize the value of the space, you're going to ignore it. So it has nothing to do with the objective value of the design space, the objective value of a resource, the objective value of information. It matters more so on what the human agent is able to generate in the moment, what they're able to consider over time, and how those ideas then manifest in terms of perceptions of the direction, the design space that needs to be exploited to then resolve the issues they're designing for.
Very interesting. Thank you.
All right, we've got about 5 minutes left. Are there any other questions for Dr. Illingworth?
When you're talking about so like test selection and the cost of these tests with doctors, in the real world, that cost of a test isn't necessarily directly paid by the doctor, right? In some cases, they might make more money from ordering, more expensive tests or something. And how does that sort of layer of separation between the test of cost and what's actually experienced by, say, like a real world doctor change how that test selection behavior might actually manifest in the real world?
That's a good question. The thing about it is that even though the physician is not directly experiencing the monetary costs of acquiring that the results for that medical test, there is a time delay, and oftentimes that could get lengthy if many individuals are ordering the exact same test at the same time. There's also this phenomenon of empty hand syndrome, where physicians are going to feel like they walk back into a patient's room without having done anything. And that's going to be a very costly emotional experience for them. They also tend to engage in they dictate their medical practice as a consequence of avoiding costs all the time, sometimes specifically in terms of malpractice lawsuits. So there are many potential costs that are constantly lingering over the head of the physician that have nothing to do with the monetary expense. You can imagine they're taking care of very many patients at the same time. There could be a cost to having to wait an hour. There could be a cost to not ordering the test earlier. A lot of it's temporal. I'll acknowledge that some of that is repetitive, but the perceived costs do not have to be financial. A lot of these can be cognitive, and you have to understand that they have limitations in their capacity to maintain all this information at the same time. And there are, of course, order effects. Like we know that physicians will change their diagnosis if you present them the exact same information, but in a different order. So there are considerations, or at the very least, those who are aware of this kind of thing, that they do have bias. They do have more experience with some medical tests than others. They have an easier time interpreting some results than others. And so there are a lot of things that can enter the valuation process that have nothing to do with monetary expense, right? You know, like in these paradigms, it's really clean and neat to characterize everything in terms of the game dollars. Like if you're right, you get game dollars. If you select a test, you lose game dollars. In the real world, right, patients' lives are on the line. People die. You have very many people's careers on the line. Yours, any other physician who's helping you, the nurses who work on your team. Like there's a lot of complexities that contribute to these valuation judgments. And so the fact that we make them clean in these lab experiments, I'll acknowledge, is sometimes not complex enough to map directly onto the real world. But they are there. And the degree to which we can get people to think about many more elements of the decision environment, the better we're replicating that more complex environment in the laboratory.
Yep, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you for taking that last question. That puts us at time. So everyone, thank you for attending. And again, Dr. Illingworth, thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, guys.